It was a quiet morning in late October, the kind where the fog still clung low to the streets and the scent of dew lingered in the air. In a small town on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, lived a man named Walter Granger. 60 years old as of 2 weeks ago, Walter sat on the porch of the little craftsman home he'd inherited from his father. His hands, still rough from years of carpentry and construction, held a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across the street, kids were boarding the school bus, full of energy, dreams, questions. Walter watched them disappear, a flicker of something unnamed stirring in his chest. He had spent most of his life building things for others. Homes, decks, schools. Even the local library bore his mark in the framing and finish. And yet, here he was now on a Thursday morning, wondering what he had left to build for himself. He wasn't sick. He wasn't broke. He wasn't even unhappy. But he felt something creeping in that he couldn't name. A quiet voice that whispered, "This is it, you've peaked. The best is behind you." That's when he remembered something his mother used to say. She'd been a firecracker of a woman, working as a nurse well into her 70s. She once told him, as she was patching up a cut on his hand when he was 12, "You don't stop when you're tired, you stop when you're done. And son, you get to decide when that is." It had been almost 40 years since he heard her say that, but the words suddenly felt alive again. Walter went inside and pulled out an old leather-bound notebook he hadn't touched since his 30s. It was filled with sketches of boats, tiny cabins, and once, a detailed blueprint for a community woodworking school he had dreamed of opening someday. That dream had been buried beneath mortgage payments, parenting, and 1,000 forgotten weekends. But now the house was paid off. His daughter, Mallory, had kids of her own and lived 2 towns over. And Walter had something most people didn't realize was worth its weight in gold: time. The next week, he drove into Portland and visited a local community center. He asked about volunteering, teaching woodworking to kids. The director, a woman named June who looked barely 30, stared at him like she wasn't sure what to make of this tall, quiet man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt. But she nodded. She gave him Wednesday afternoons. The first week, only 2 kids showed up. A boy named Eli and a girl named Jasmine. Eli was shy, barely spoke, while Jasmine had a quick tongue and sharper instincts with a saw than Walter had expected. He showed them how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand with the grain, how to find the heart of a piece of wood. And something shifted in him. Every Wednesday, he found himself more alive than he had been in years. Within 3 months, the class had grown to 15 kids. Walter's name began to spread beyond the community center. Local carpenters began dropping off scraps of wood, leftover supplies, even offering to guest teach. A local news story ran a feature on the man who never stopped building. When Walter watched the story on TV, his eyes welled up, not from pride, but from the realization that what he thought had ended was only just beginning. One day, while packing up tools after class, Jasmine asked him, "Mr. Granger, what made you start doing this? You could be retired, traveling, chilling on a beach or something." Walter smiled, a soft laugh in his chest. "I thought I was done," he said. "But then I realized I didn't come this far just to stop at 60. That night, he stayed up late sketching. Not a boat this time. A new blueprint. A place where older adults could come and teach the skills they'd spent a lifetime learning. Mechanics, bakers, artists, musicians. A space where knowledge didn't fade with age. It grew louder, brighter. A place called the Second Draft. Walter found himself talking to city officials, applying for grants, shaking hands with people 20 years younger than him. He was out of his comfort zone nearly every day. But he also felt more alive than ever. At 61, he stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the community center he once only dreamed about. A local newspaper reporter asked him, "What would you tell other people your age who feel like life has slowed down?" Walter looked out at the crowd, full of kids, teachers, parents, elders, and answered without pause. "I tell them this isn't the end of the book. It's just the second draft. And it's usually better than the first." But Walter's story didn't end there. A few months after the center opened, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived, handwritten, with a return address from Detroit. It was from his old friend Tony, someone Walter hadn't seen in over 40 years. Tony had watched the news feature online and recognized him instantly. The letter was full of memories, but at the end, Tony wrote something that struck a chord. "You were always the one with the big ideas, Walt. I just followed your lead. But seeing what you're doing now, man, I'm thinking maybe I still got a few good years in me too." That's when Walter got an idea. What if the second draft wasn't just one building? What if it was a network? A movement? He reached out to Tony, who had spent decades in auto repair. Together, they hosted a virtual workshop called Tools and Time, where older tradespeople taught online classes to teens across the country. Word spread. A retired fashion designer from Atlanta, a 70-year-old jazz guitarist from Chicago, a former chef from San Diego. All of them joined. Walter became more than a local legend. He became a quiet symbol of what happens when you refuse to close the book too early. And yet, even then, something inside him whispered that the story wasn't finished. Because as he stood one morning in his now bustling community center, listening to the hum of saws, the chatter of young hands learning old skills, and the sound of purpose ringing in every corner of the room, Walter felt the same thrill he had as a boy making his first birdhouse. The thrill of beginning. And he knew then that as long as he had the breath to build, to teach, to give, he would never really be done. Because you didn't come this far just to stop at 60. And neither did he. The invitation came in an ordinary envelope. There was no gold seal, no thick embossed letters, just a simple cream-colored card tucked into a white envelope with a stamp slightly off-center. Walter almost didn't notice it in the pile of junk mail and local flyers. But when he opened it, standing barefoot in his kitchen one early morning, the weight of it settled into his chest like gravity. He had been invited to speak at the National Lifelong Learning Summit in Chicago, a 3-day conference of educators, thinkers, and innovators from around the country. The email copy that followed later that afternoon confirmed the details. Walter Granger, keynote speaker. Subject: Redefining Legacy After 60. He laughed softly when he read that title aloud. Legacy was never something he set out to build. He didn't have a mission statement or a 5-year plan. He had simply refused to shrink. He had chosen motion when comfort whispered stillness. When he told June at the center, she clapped her hands and shouted in the middle of a woodworking class. Jasmine, now taller, her hands surer, who still attended every Wednesday, hugged him and said, "You better wear a good shirt. You're gonna be on YouTube." 2 weeks later, Walter stood in a hotel room on the 17th floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. He looked out over a city he hadn't seen in 25 years. The streets below pulsed with life, horns and sirens and conversations blending into a city's breath. He wore the same blazer he'd worn to his daughter's wedding, the one with the slightly frayed sleeve. In his hand was a folded sheet of paper, but he didn't need it anymore. He had practiced the speech again and again, not for memorization, but to feel every word. The ballroom was packed. Hundreds of seats, cameras, lights. A younger man named Ron introduced him with the enthusiasm of a TED Talk host. But when Walter stepped up to the podium, the room changed. The audience quieted, not with formality, but with reverence, as if they knew they were about to hear something real. He didn't start with stats or stories. He began with a question. What if the most important part of your life hasn't happened yet? There was a pause. Then he continued. I turned 60 not long ago. And when I did, I thought I was supposed to slow down, to accept the idea that the big moments had passed and what lay ahead was just maintenance. Doctor visits, hobby hours, watching things wind down. He paused, let the silence settle in. But then one day, I realized, I didn't come this far just to stop at 60. He spoke of his daughter, his late wife Margaret, who had once dreamed of opening a flower shop but chose stability and secretarial work instead. He talked about the empty mornings, the loss of purpose, and the rediscovery of it in sawdust, in small hands holding hammers, in eyes that lit up when the shape of something emerged from rough wood. He talked about the second draft, not just the building, but the idea that we are not meant to peak at 40, that we are not obsolete by 60, that experience is not something to retire, It's something to pass down like fire. When he finished, there was no polite applause. There was a standing ovation. People cried. Some shouted, yes, like they were at a revival. A woman in the front row, gray hair swept into a bun, mouthed the words thank you as she clapped. After the talk, Walter didn't go back to his room. He sat in the lobby cafe for hours, speaking with people who had flown from across the country. A retired police chief who wanted to start mentoring young men in his city. A former dancer who hadn't moved like that in years and felt the urge again. A 74-year-old woman who had never told anyone she still wrote poetry in secret. One by one, they confessed to him things they hadn't said out loud in years, dreams, regrets, quiet little flames they thought had long gone out. Walter didn't have advice for each of them, but he had a listening ear, and the truth of his own story as proof. By the time he flew back to Portland, the ideas had already begun to bloom. Invitations poured in from small towns and big cities alike. Retirement homes asked for second draft workshops. High schools requested intergenerational skill-sharing days. Libraries wanted to host exhibitions of projects built by older hands. Walter knew he couldn't do it alone, so he didn't. He built a small team, June, of course. Tony moved to Portland, bringing with him the kind of mechanical genius that made anything with an engine roar back to life. Jasmine, now 18, became his assistant and future successor. She handled emails, scheduling, marketing. She was studying community development at a local college. Inspired by what the center had done for her, they launched something new, a mobile version of the second draft. A traveling van, custom-built with tools, materials, and space for pop-up workshops. They visited rural towns, underserved neighborhoods, even tribal lands where knowledge had been passed down orally for generations. One winter, in a town called Red Bluff, they held a workshop outside a closed-down gas station. Walter stood next to an 82-year-old man named Richard who had been a luthier guitar maker for most of his life. Together, they helped two teenage boys build their own ukuleles from scratch. When the boys strummed their first notes, Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I haven't seen a student in 30 years, he said. Later that evening, as they packed the van, Jasmine asked Walter if he ever imagined life would turn out this way. Walter looked out at the sky, stars sharp and bright over the desert horizon. "I thought my story was finished," he said quietly. "But maybe we don't write the ending. Maybe we just keep turning the page." And he wasn't done turning yet, because in the back of his mind, a new idea had begun to form. One that involved bringing the second draft overseas, partnering with communities in other countries where elders were still deeply respected but lacked platforms. A documentary team had already contacted him. A publisher was interested in a memoir. But Walter wasn't thinking about fame or legacy. He was thinking about a little boy in Kenya who could learn carpentry from a retired cabinet maker in Cincinnati. Or a grandmother in Tokyo teaching a child in Toronto how to sew traditional kimonos over video call. He was thinking about what could happen if we all just refused to stop. The story wasn't done. And it wouldn't be for a long, long time. 3 months after that winter in Red Bluff, Walter stood once again in front of a map, this time not of Portland, but of the world. The wall of the expanded workshop space had been converted into a global vision board. Small red pins dotted locations where new connections were forming. Nairobi, Osaka, Glasgow, Medellin. The second draft was no longer just a Portland project. It had become a movement, an idea whose time had finally come. It had all started with an email. A young teacher named Samuel from Nairobi had watched Walter's Chicago speech online. In his note, he described his own grandfather, a retired furniture maker, who now spent most of his days sitting on a plastic chair under the mango tree, silently watching the neighborhood children run past. Samuel wrote, "I know my grandfather still has more to give, but no one ever asks him anymore." Walter couldn't stop thinking about that line. He had once been that man, sitting in stillness, feeling the world pass him by. And now someone halfway across the world was telling him there were thousands more just like him. So Walter replied. And 2 weeks later, he and Jasmine were on a plane to Kenya. It was Jasmine's first trip out of the country. At 22, She was now the official co-director of the second draft. The team had grown from 3 to 12 in less than a year, and Jasmine had emerged as the natural leader of the next phase. Her energy was magnetic, her ability to adapt uncanny, and her presence, especially to the younger volunteers, was that of someone who had found her calling. In Nairobi, they were welcomed by Samuel and his family. They visited his grandfather, Mzee Baraka, who had once handcrafted wooden beds and ceremonial chairs for weddings across the region. Now 81, his hands were still strong, but his tools lay rusting in a corner. Walter asked him what he missed most. Passing on the knowledge, Baraka answered in Swahili, which Samuel translated. It's like I have a full pot, but no one comes to eat. That simple metaphor became the motto for the Kenyan chapter. Let the elders serve the feast. Over the next 10 days, they helped transform a disused community hall into a maker's space. They repainted walls, repaired tables, and sourced donated tools from local businesses. Mzee Baraka trained 6 young apprentices. Jasmine held storytelling workshops where elders shared not just skills, but songs, legends, and recipes. Walter watched all of it quietly, not trying to lead, but letting the energy guide itself. At one point, a local elder named Mama Agatha placed her hand gently on his shoulder and said, "You did not bring us something new. You reminded us of what we already had." They returned to Portland with full hearts and big plans. Jasmine proposed an international exchange program. She wanted to build a digital bridge between elders in different countries. Imagine a grandmother in Mexico teaching a boy in Alabama how to weave, or a Scottish fisherman showing a teenager in the Philippines how to mend nets. Walter smiled. "You're thinking too small," he joked. So they began developing the Second Draft Network, a digital platform that could match elders with youth based on skill sets, language, and interest. Jasmine led the development team, securing grants and support from global NGOs. Walter focused on outreach, delivering virtual talks in universities, speaking at global aging conferences, and most importantly, continuing his work at the original workshop in Portland every Saturday. It was there, one rainy morning, that a familiar face returned. It was Arthur, one of Walter's oldest friends. Once a marketing executive, now retired and recently divorced. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed by grief Walter recognized all too well. They sat in silence for a while before Arthur finally spoke. "I don't know who I am anymore." Walter didn't offer a lecture. He simply handed him a chisel and said, "Help me finish this." The piece they worked on together became a bench, simple, clean, sturdy. It now sat at the entrance of the workshop with a brass plaque that read, "For those just arriving to their second beginning." As the months passed, something remarkable happened. People began to bring not just themselves, but pieces of their pasts. A retired conductor donated a broken violin and taught kids how to repair and play it. A former Olympic swimmer led water safety classes for underprivileged teens. A woman who had survived breast cancer ran weekly healing circles with young women battling anxiety and identity loss. The line between giver and receiver blurred. Stories flowed both ways. Wisdom wasn't just passed down, it was passed around, weaving every generation into a larger narrative. Walter was now 64. His beard was almost fully white, and his hands slower, but steadier. He moved with more deliberation and spoke with less urgency, not because he had lost his fire, but because he had found his rhythm. He often found himself watching Jasmine work, feeling pride that no words could express. She didn't need him to lead anymore, but she always involved him. They planned a global summit, a gathering of second draft chapters from around the world. It would be held in Portugal the following spring. One night, Walter stood alone in the Portland workshop after everyone had left. The lights were dim. The smell of cedar still hung in the air. On the wall were framed photos of the earliest days. He and June hammering nails, Jasmine at age 10 holding up her first toolbox, a grainy photo of Margaret watching from the doorway on one of the few days she'd visited. He sat down on the bench he'd built with Arthur and ran his fingers over the plaque. And then, without meaning to, he began to cry. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming awareness of how far he had come. He hadn't just built tables or benches or workshops. He had built bridges between past and future, between generations, between who he had been and who he dared to become. And somewhere in the stillness, he whispered to the night, "I didn't come this far just to stop at 60, and I'm still not done." The summit in Portugal was Jasmine's idea. She called it the Renewal Gathering. Not a conference, not a seminar, a gathering, a place where stories, not credentials, would lead. Walter liked the name immediately. It had warmth. It had weight, like something old and sacred returning to life. They chose Lisbon for a reason. It was a city that lived in layers. Ancient stone roads running beneath modern cafes. Songs drifting from Fado singers in the Alfama district. History and reinvention hand in hand. It was also a crossroads of continents, a place where Europe, Africa, and South America had all passed through in different eras. The perfect symbol, Jasmine said, for a movement that wasn't just about growing older but about growing wider. For months, Jasmine led planning calls with partners across the globe. Translators were hired, visas secured, travel arrangements made for more than 400 people from 27 countries. Elders, youth, volunteers, and curious observers. Some were renowned educators. Others had never left their villages. It didn't matter. The only requirement was to come with a story and a willingness to listen. Walter wasn't just attending. He would give the closing talk. But this time he didn't feel nervous. He didn't even write anything down. He trusted the moment to guide him, the way which sometimes tells you what shape it wants to become. When they arrived in Lisbon a few days before the gathering, Walter and Jasmine walked the hilly streets in the golden afternoon light. She showed him the main venue, a historic library built in the 1700s, now restored with modern accessibility. Sunlight poured in through tall arched windows, landing on tables where translated name tags and handmade welcome gifts waited. Walter picked up one of the name tags. It read, Mariana dos Santos, 72, breadmaker, Porto. He smiled. Jasmine saw the look on his face. "They're all coming," she said. "Every last one of them." And they did. The first day began with silence. Not by mistake but by design. No one was allowed to speak for the first 10 minutes after entering the space. Instead, they walked among old photographs printed and mounted along the walls. Elders teaching, youth watching, hands shaping wood, mixing paint, planting gardens. Across cultures, across continents. Then the stories began. A Maori elder from New Zealand told of preserving tribal dances by training young choreographers via Zoom. A Pakistani woman, formerly a surgeon, shared how she began holding art classes in her kitchen for neighborhood girls after retiring. A Cuban guitarist in his 80s played a melody he had once composed during a prison sentence, now performed for children learning music for the first time. Each story, offered without performance or ego, found a home in the room. Walter spent most of the summit listening, sometimes sitting in the back with headphones for translation. Other times, standing against the wall near the entrance like a quiet usher. He watched Jasmine moving among guests like she'd been born for this, introducing, translating, connecting dots. Her eyes lit up when she talked. Her voice carried like a song of welcome. On the second evening, as they returned to their guest house, Walter turned to her as they walked along the cobbled sidewalk. "You know you're the future of this, right?" She nodded, but didn't speak right away. Then she said, "I don't feel pressure. I feel called." That night, Walter dreamed of Margaret. She was standing beneath a tall tree, smiling. In the dream, she said only one thing. "You kept going." On the final day, as the sun cast soft shadows through the windows of the old library, Walter stepped onto the platform to give his closing talk. No lights, no slides, just him. He looked around at the faces, wrinkled and smooth, brown, pale, golden, freckled. Some listening through headphones, others leaning forward, hands clasped. He began with a memory. "When I was young, my father told me that growing old meant losing things. Your speed, your strength, your edge. For a long time I believed him. But now I know he was only half right. You do lose things, but you also gain something far more important. You gain vision. You see beyond the trends, beyond the noise, beyond the rush. You see the long arc of what matters. And if you choose to, you can become a lantern. Not a spotlight, not a firework. A quiet, steady light that helps others find their way. He paused. We call this the second draft. But maybe it's not the second at all. Maybe it's the truest. The one written after the distractions fall away. After the fear softens. After you remember what your life was always trying to tell you. A hush settled over the room. Even the air seemed to lean closer. Then he said, "Whatever age you are, let me leave you with this. You didn't come this far to stop now. Not at 60. Not at 80. Not at 100. You are still becoming. The story is still being written. Turn the page." When he stepped down, there was no applause. There was something better. People stood in silence. Some with tears. Some with soft, reverent smiles. And then, one by one, they embraced. Jasmine was waiting near the aisle. She hugged Walter and whispered, "You wrote the beginning. Now I'll write the middle." Walter looked at her, eyes misting. "Just promise me you won't write the end." She grinned. "No chance." Later, as the guests departed and the Lisbon air turned cool, Walter stood at the doorway of the library and watched the sunset paint the city gold. The world felt larger than ever, but somehow also more intimate, more connected, like a giant circle slowly knitting itself back together. And as he watched Jasmine helping an elder from Turkey load her suitcase into a cab, laughing and waving, he knew the truth. This was never just his story. It was everyone's. And it would go on, across oceans, across languages, across generations, still waiting for their turn to shine. The second draft had become something more. A movement, family, a living legacy, and it was just getting started. 10 years passed. The world, as always, changed. Cities grew taller, faster. Technology advanced in surges. Entire careers vanished. New ones were born. But amid the digital storms and shifting tides of modern life, the second draft endured, not as a trend or a novelty, but as a steady, quiet revolution. By 2035, what had started in a small Portland workshop now had chapters in 52 countries. In some places, they were called the renewal houses, in others craft circles or legacy schools. The names varied, but the heart remained the same. Elders sharing lived wisdom with the young, not as instructors from a podium, but as companions on the path. Jasmine, now in her early 30s, had grown into an international figure, not by branding herself, but by staying rooted in service. She still refused to wear anything but her workshop apron during most public events. People would laugh at that, especially when she'd step onto stages alongside heads of state or corporate leaders. But she always said the apron reminded her what she was really there to do: build. She led with a rare blend of clarity and compassion. At the UN Assembly for Intergenerational Innovation, she spoke without notes, opening with a simple question. What if we stopped treating aging as a decline and started honoring it as an ascension? The room, filled with economists and demographers, sat in silence. Every culture that has lasted, she continued, has done so by placing its elders not on the sidelines, but at the center. We don't need more studies to prove that. We need to remember it. That speech was replayed across the world. Schools, universities, even businesses began reaching out to integrate second draft models. Intergenerational mentorship programs spread through industries, agriculture, tech, education, even gaming. Elders became embedded in product teams, classrooms, startups, and community clinics. In Tokyo, an 86-year-old former train conductor helped a robotics firm develop more intuitive transport interfaces, because he still remembered what it felt like to hold 1,000 people's safety in his hands every day. In a small town in Canada, retired midwives trained young doulas through weekly story circles. In Brazil, a samba dancer in her 70s created a program for movement therapy for children with cerebral palsy. Each story built another stone in the foundation of something much bigger than a nonprofit. It was now a global belief system, and at the center of it still was the Portland workshop. Walter, now 74, remained its soul. He no longer moved as quickly, but he was there every Thursday and Saturday, sitting by the window bench, offering advice when asked. He no longer needed to teach with his hands. His presence was its own lesson. He had handed over operations to a young craftsman named Eli, a former high school dropout who'd once wandered into the workshop looking for warmth one rainy afternoon. Now Eli was training others, including a cohort of recently retired engineers transitioning into community education. One late spring morning, as birdsong drifted in through the open doors and the smell of sawdust mingled with fresh coffee, Walter received a package. It was from Lisbon. Inside was a leather-bound book. On the cover, Second Draft, A Decade of Becoming. Jasmine had compiled it. Stories, photographs, letters, moments, all chronicled, beautifully bound. At the bottom of the last page, she had written, "We're not preserving the past. We're honoring the bridge between then and tomorrow. Thank you for showing us the way." Walter closed the book slowly, letting the warmth of the words settle in. He didn't cry this time. He simply felt full, like a life well cooked, ready to be served again and again. He thought of Margaret often now. In quiet hours at twilight, he would sometimes talk to her. Not out loud, just in his heart. "You were right, love. There was more to do, more to give." That afternoon, Jasmine arrived unannounced, carrying 2 coffees and wearing the same dusty apron she'd worn 10 years ago. "They asked me to keynote in Johannesburg," she said casually, setting the drinks down. "Big Global Climate Resilience Summit. I want to bring 2 elders with me. From here." Walter grinned. "They're not going to know what hit them." She laughed. Then her tone softened. "One day, I want to bring my kids here." "You planning on having them soon?" "Not yet. But when I do, I want them to know this place. I want them to meet people who remember a world before screens and speed. I want them to hear the stories that built the ground they'll walk on." Walter looked around the workshop. The old tools on the wall, the generations of handprints on the beams, the faded chalkboard with a new quote every week. That week said, "Legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're still here." He looked back at Jasmine. "Then we'd better keep the place ready." They shared a quiet moment. No rush, no agenda. Just 2 people, decades apart in age, standing at the same point in time with the same hope, that the world would continue to grow wiser, kinder, more connected. Outside, a group of teenagers had arrived early. One of them waved through the window. Jasmine waved back. "They're early. They're eager," Walter said. "They're ready." And so, once again, the door opened. New voices entered. New stories began. And the second draft turned yet another page. Its chapters now written in every language, its heart beating in every shared moment between young and old. The story, as promised, did not end. Because a good life doesn't finish. It unfolds. Years later, long after the Lisbon summit and long after Walter's final days at the workshop, the second draft lived on, not just as a movement but as a way of seeing the world. It no longer needed one man or one leader. It had become part of the culture, part of the conversation, part of the solution. In cities and villages, on mountain ridges and coastal towns, children grew up knowing that age did not mean after. It meant also a teacher, also a builder, also a dreamer. The term retired slowly gave way to something better, re-engaged. People no longer asked, "What did you use to do?" They asked, "What are you creating now?" Jasmine, now with children of her own, often told them bedtime stories about an old man with kind eyes and calloused hands who once thought his best days were behind him, until he discovered that the end of one chapter is simply the start of the next. And across the world, thousands of unnamed elders sat beside thousands of curious young minds, passing on tools, recipes, melodies, lessons, not with urgency, but with the steady grace of people who understood the deeper truth, that life is not a single flame burning down to ash. It is a torch, meant to be passed, again and again, lighting the way for those still finding their path. So if you're reading this now, at any age, wondering whether your story still matters, hear this. You didn't come this far just to stop at 60. You didn't come this far to be quiet. You came this far to begin again, to give what only you can give. To rise not as someone who is finished, but as someone who is finally ready. The second draft is calling. Pick up the pen and keep writing.